Room 412 had gone through 3 nurses in 2 days, and none of them had lasted more than an hour. The man in the bed wasn't violent, not exactly, but he was a wall of muscle and scar tissue who flinched at every hand that came near him, who gripped the bed rail hard enough to leave dents when an orderly tried to check his blood pressure, who had once thrown a water pitcher across the room simply because a technician had approached from his blind side. His name, according to the chart, was Mason Cade. His body told a different story than the paperwork. Shrapnel scars along his ribs, a knee reconstructed more times than anyone could count, a tattoo on his forearm that the medical staff had all seen but none of them understood, a trident wrapped around the Roman numeral 7. He had been brought in after a car accident that reopened an old leg injury, and from the moment he arrived, Walter Reed's staff had treated him like an unexploded device. Careful, distant, afraid. The head of orthopedics, Dr. Colton Reyes, had already written him off as uncooperative, a problem patient who refused physical therapy and threatened to sign himself out against medical advice every single morning. Nobody had asked why. Nobody had looked past the bandages to the man underneath them, a man who had spent a decade in rooms far darker than this one, who had learned that hands reaching for him in the night rarely meant safety. Dana Whitfield started her rotation on a Tuesday, and she read his chart twice before she ever stepped through his door. Something about the pattern bothered her. Not the injuries themselves, but the way he reacted to being handled, the specific flinch when someone came at him from the left, the way he counted under his breath when his heart rate monitor beeped in a certain rhythm. She had seen that before. She had lived that before. Before nursing school, before the quiet civilian life she had built for herself, Dana had spent 6 years as a combat medic attached to a naval special warfare task force, patching up men in places that didn't appear on any map, learning the particular language of operators who trusted almost no one and feared almost nothing except being helpless in front of strangers. She hadn't told anyone at Walter Reed about that chapter of her life. She wore her scrubs, she did her job, and she let people assume she was simply good at her work, which she was, but the truth ran deeper than competence. When she walked into room 412 that afternoon and saw Mason Cade sitting rigid against the headboard, his jaw locked, his good hand curled into a fist despite the 4-line tape to it, she recognized something in him instantly, the specific stillness of a man who had trained his body to survive contact he hadn't chosen. The orderlies who had followed her in to assist backed toward the door out of habit, bracing for the same explosion that had ended every previous attempt. Dana held up a hand without looking at them, a small gesture that told them to wait. She approached the bed slowly, deliberately, keeping herself in his line of sight the entire time, and Mason's eyes tracked her the way a man tracks a threat, sharp and unblinking. She didn't reach for him. She didn't reach for the chart. She simply stood at the foot of the bed and said, in a voice pitched low and even, "Sierra 7, you're stateside. You're at Walter Reed. Nobody in this room is going to touch you without telling you first." The room went silent in a way that had nothing to do with volume. Mason's fist slowly uncurled. His eyes, which had been fixed somewhere past her shoulder on the door, snapped to her face for the first time since he'd been admitted. "What did you just say?" he asked, and his voice cracked in a way that betrayed just how long it had been since anyone had said those two words to him. Sierra 7. The call sign that had died along with the classified operation that ended his career, the name that existed in exactly one place outside his own memory. A redacted personnel file that no hospital nurse should have ever had reason to see. Dana didn't answer right away. She simply pulled a chair to the side of his bed, sat down at eye level instead of standing over him, and said, "Because I was there when they gave it to you." The orderlies exchanged a look and slipped out of the room, sensing correctly that whatever was happening no longer required their presence. Mason stared at Dana as though trying to place her face against a decade of memory, against the chaos of blacked-out helicopters and forward operating bases where faces blurred together under grime and exhaustion, and the strange intimacy of shared danger. "Corpsman Whitfield," he finally said, and it wasn't a question anymore. It was recognition dawning slow and disbelieving across his face. The kind of recognition that cracks something open in a man who has spent years convincing himself that the people who once had his back are scattered to the wind or gone entirely. "You patched me up outside Kandahar. I thought you were a myth. Guys used to swap your name like you were a ghost story. The medic who ran into a firefight in flip-flops because her boots hadn't dried." A laugh escaped him, rusty and unfamiliar. The first sound anyone at Walter Reed had heard from him that wasn't a warning growl. Dana allowed herself a small smile. They were prototype boots. Terrible traction. I'll die on that hill. For the first time in 2 days, Mason Cade's shoulders dropped, the tension bleeding out of muscles that had been coiled tight since the accident. Since long before the accident. Since the day his unit's final mission went sideways and left him with a leg that would never work right and a silence about what happened that he had carried alone ever since. Dana reached for his wrist then, slow and telegraphed, checking his pulse the way any nurse would. And this time he didn't flinch. He watched her hands instead of bracing against them, and something in his chest eased in a way physical therapy and painkillers had never managed to touch. "Nobody here knows what 7 means," he said quietly, glancing down at the tattoo on his forearm. "Nobody asks. They just see a difficult patient." Dana's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. Something that understood exactly how much weight sat inside that sentence. How much isolation a man could carry inside a hospital full of people whose job was supposedly to heal him. "I know what it means," she said. "And I know what it cost you." Outside the door, unnoticed by either of them, Dr. Reyes had paused mid-stride down the hallway, drawn by the unfamiliar sound of quiet conversation coming from a room that had produced nothing but tension for 2 straight days. He didn't yet understand what he was witnessing. He only knew that the man who had refused every hand extended toward him was finally, for the first time, letting someone in, and that whatever this new nurse had just done, it was something none of the senior staff had managed with all their training and all their charts. If you're feeling the weight of this moment already, imagine what happens when the truth about Sierra 7's final mission comes out in front of the entire hospital. Subscribe now so you don't miss Chapter 2, where the past Mason buried refuses to stay buried any longer. Word travels fast in a hospital, faster than most people realize, and by the following morning the story of room 412 had become the quiet talk of the orthopedics wing. The uncooperative patient was cooperating. The man who had refused physical therapy for 2 days was up on his crutches by 7 a.m., working through range of motion exercises with Dana at his side, her voice steady and encouraging in a way that made the difference between a man enduring pain and a man pushing through it with purpose. Dr. Reyes watched from the hallway, arms crossed, equal parts relieved and suspicious, the kind of suspicious that comes from 20 years of medicine teaching him that sudden transformations usually have an explanation worth understanding. He pulled Dana aside before her shift ended and asked her plainly what had changed. She hesitated, weighing how much of her own history she was ready to hand over to a colleague she barely knew, and then decided that Mason Cade had spent long enough being handled like a mystery instead of a man. She told Reyes the truth, that she had served, that she and Mason had crossed paths on deployment, that some wounds required someone who spoke the specific language of what he had survived. Reyes absorbed this quietly, nodded, and for the first time treated her not as a new hire, but as someone whose expertise ran deeper than her job title suggested. What none of them expected was for the past to walk through the front door 2 days later. Dana was midway through changing the dressing on Mason's leg, the two of them talking easily now, trading old stories with the particular dark humor that combat veterans use to defuse memories too heavy to carry any other way, when a commotion rose from the hallway. Voices, footsteps, the unmistakable cadence of men who moved with purpose. Mason went rigid again, but this time it wasn't fear, it was something closer to disbelief. Through the door came 3 men in dress uniform, and behind them, moving slower, leaning on a cane but walking under his own power, a retired Rear Admiral named Walter Hollis, the man who had commanded Sierra 7's task force a decade earlier and who Mason had believed, for years, was the reason the operation's failure had been quietly pinned on his own shoulders instead of investigated properly. Mason's hand tightened on the bed rail, old anger surfacing fast and hard, the kind that had festered in silence because no one had ever given him the chance to say it out loud. "You've got some nerve," he started, but Hollis raised a hand, and the room fell quiet the way rooms do around men who have earned that kind of authority. "I know," Hollis said, his voice rough with age and something that sounded uncomfortably like regret. "I know I've got nerve showing up here after all this time, but the file got reopened 8 months ago. Full review. New evidence came out of a debrief nobody wanted to touch for years." He reached into his jacket and produced a folder, thin but heavy with implication, and set it on the foot of the bed. The mission wasn't compromised because of anything you did, Sierra 7. Intelligence was faulty. Command knew it within a year and buried it because admitting the error meant admitting men died for bad information. You carried the blame because it was easier than the truth, and that was wrong. And it's taken me too long to stand here and say so to your face. The room went utterly silent. Dana stood back, giving space to a moment that belonged entirely to Mason, watching a decade of unspoken guilt visibly lift off a man's shoulders in real time, watching the tattoo on his forearm suddenly mean something different than it had 5 minutes earlier. No longer a scar from a mistake he carried alone, but a mark of service the record had finally, belatedly, acknowledged as honorable. One of the officers behind Hollis stepped forward and, with the kind of ceremony usually reserved for far more formal occasions, presented Mason with a small case. Inside sat a challenge coin, freshly minted, engraved with the same trident and Roman numeral that marked his skin, along with words that made his throat tighten in a way 10 years of pain medication and physical therapy never had. Cleared, honored, remembered. Mason held the coin for a long moment without speaking, his jaw working, his eyes bright in a way that had nothing to do with the fluorescent hospital lighting. When he finally looked up, it wasn't at Hollis or the officers. It was at Dana, standing quietly by the window where she'd retreated to let the moment breathe. "You knew this was coming," he said. And it wasn't an accusation, just wonder. Dana shook her head. "I had no idea. I just knew you deserved someone who saw you as a person instead of a problem while you waited to find out." Hollis, overhearing this, turned to study her properly for the first time, and something clicked behind his eyes. The flip-flops, the reputation, the medic soldiers still talked about a decade later. "Corpsman Whitfield," he said slowly, "I owe you a debt too. Half my unit came home because of decisions you made under fire that weren't in anyone's training manual." Dana simply nodded, uncomfortable with the spotlight the way people usually are when the credit lands on actions that felt, at the time, like the only possible choice. Word of what happened in room 412 spread through Walter Reed within hours, and by the next morning it had reached well beyond the hospital walls, the story of an admiral personally clearing the name of a soldier the system had failed, delivered by the one person who had refused to see him as broken. Mason's recovery accelerated from that day forward, not just physically but in every way that mattered. The crutches becoming a formality rather than a fight, his sessions with physical therapy turning into conversations rather than confrontations. Dana stayed on his case through the rest of his stay, and on the day he was finally discharged, wheeled toward the front doors under hospital policy despite barely needing the chair anymore, he stopped her in the lobby and pressed the challenge coin into her palm. "I want you to have this," he said. "You gave me my name back before anyone gave me my record back. That matters more." Dana tried to refuse, but he closed her fingers around it and shook his head, and she understood that some gifts aren't meant to be declined. If a story like this moved you, a man forgotten by the system, saved not by rank or bureaucracy but by one nurse who refused to let him disappear, that's exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell. Subscribe now, hit the bell, and join us for the next episode, because there are more hidden heroes out there whose stories deserve to be told.